Okay, so thank you everyone for bearing with me while I figure out our technical difficulties. And thank you for joining us today for Preservation of Home Archives. So we do have an in-person audience and a virtual audience. So for my in-person audience, I would just ask you to turn off your cell phones for me or silence them. We also have restrooms straight through the back, and there is a water fountain to the left. Near the elevator. Also, because we are recording with a live audience here, just ask that you raise your hand for your questions, and then also just be aware that we are recording this for our YouTube channel. For our video audience, I am your moderator today. So if you have any questions, feel free to put them into the chat box, and then we'll save them for the end of the presentation. And so let's move on to our speaker. This is Gabrielle Sanchez. She's a contract archivist with the Smithsonian. She also worked here as a library associate here at Thomas Balch Library. So we're very happy to have her. So let's give her a warm welcome.
All right, thank you. My name is Gabrielle. I'm a archivist for the National Anthropological Archives, which is part of the Department of Anthropology and the National Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian Institution. And I've also worked as an archivist and librarian here at the Balch, at the Library of Congress, other institutions in the Washington, D.C. area and New York City, where I'm from originally. And today I'm going to be talking about the tools and techniques and methodologies that archivists use to preserve the materials in their collections and how you can use those with your own home archives.
Click on the screen and then it, or on the.
You can't just not.
Now try.
Yeah. Okay, great. All right, so today I'm going to be limiting our discussion to paper, books, and photographs. And what we're not going to talk about are audio-visual recordings, so audio cassettes, old home movies, Super 8, VHS, things like that. I'm not going to be talking about digital media, whether that's born digital, like digital photographs with the digital camera, digital documents, things like that, digital recordings, disaster recovery, which is what happens if you have a fire or a flood. And I'm not going to be talking about complex conservation. If you have questions about any of these topics, at the end, I am very happy to sort of give you a quick summary and point you in the direction of more resources. So before we sort of get started and really get into it, there are a few ideas that I want to go over to sort of provide a framework for our discussion. And the first is conservation versus preservation. So I said we won't be talking about complex conservation, and the class is about preservation. These two terms, they sound the same, and sometimes they're used interchangeably, but they do have different meanings. So when we talk about preservation, we're talking about the steps that we're taking to maintain our materials in their current condition. So basically, we're just talking about storage and handling. When we talk about conservation, we're talking about the steps that we're taking to return our materials to an earlier condition and really talking about repairs. I am not a conservator. Conservators are highly trained professionals. They are chemists, they are historians, they are artists, they are amazing. And that is not my area of expertise at all whatsoever. And it's very important to know your limits because our second main concept is do no harm. And this one's really important. And it seems very, very much like common sense, right? But you'd be surprised, and we'll get into some times when you maybe do things that sound like a good idea, but have long-term consequences. Basically, we want to make sure that anything that we do, any preservation action is something that can be undone in the future. It's something that isn't going to be a short-term solution, it's going to create long-term problems. And that's something we really want to think through before we undertake any sort of preservation activity. And then the third idea, which I personally think is sort of the most important thing for us to really understand when we're approaching our collections, is the idea of intrinsic versus informational value. So, I'm an archivist and a special collections librarian. And like all librarians, I am interested in the informational value of the materials in my collection. So informational value could be a textual value, like in a letter or a book, right? The words. It could be a visual, like in a photograph or a drawing, or a moving image. It could be, you know, a data set, anything like that. There's the information itself. But what separates an archivist and a special collections librarian from a general collections librarian is that we're also interested in the value of the object that's in our collections as a carrier of that information. So we're trying to preserve not just only the information, but also the object. And so I have a little kind of thought experiment for us to do, to sort of kind of conceptualize this a little bit more. So if we all pretend that we are librarians and that we have in our collection 3 versions of Charles Dickens' A Tale of Two Cities. And one is a first edition inscribed by Charles Dickens himself. And the second is a modern paperback. And the third is an ebook. The informational value of these 3 items is the same. Now, yeah, okay, there may be some differences in the editions, but for the sake of argument, we're going to say the story is the same, right? It was the best of times, it was the worst times, blah, 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 right? These are the same, but the intrinsic value is different, right? And so if we had damage to these items, so let's say, like a tear in the cover or a problem like that, we're going to treat them very differently. For our ebook, that really can't happen in the same way, so we're not going to talk about that one. But for our paperback and our first edition, we're going to treat those differently. So for our paperback, we may, throw it in the trash and just order a new one. But we're not going to do that with our first edition, right? We're going to do something else. So, the first thing we might do is if it's in circulation, which it probably shouldn't be, but if it was, we're going to say, well, this shouldn't circulate. And if it's not in circulation, we may even say, well, not only can it not circulate, but we're not going to let anybody look at it for now. We're going to close this collection temporarily while we figure out what's going on, because we don't want people to use it and cause more damage. We may, depending on a lot of factors, such as, our budget, our, access to, materials and conservator and things like that, how important this title is to our collection. In general, we may just get a custom case for it. We may put it in a phase box, which is a special box for it. We may get it repaired by a conservator. Those are all things we're going to do. We're not going to do any of that with our paperback because we're just going to go probably get a new one, right? So that's the kind of thing that we need to think about. And that seems like common sense, but it's really if you really think about it in this way, it'll help you make preservation decisions and really think about how you're going to spend your time and your money and on what. So how do we determine intrinsic value? So when we think of value, the first thing we think about is monetary value. And when we talk about our Tale of Two Cities example, when we paperback, $15-20, new, brand new, used, you could buy one $2, right? A first edition of A Tale of Two Cities, maybe you're talking about $5,000 to $8,000 for something maybe not the best condition, up to $30,000 maybe for something that's in really good condition. In 2019, this copy of A Tale of Two Cities, which was inscribed by Charles Dickens to someone named Mrs. Cowden Clark, sold at Sotheby's in London for the equivalent of $137,000. And Mrs. Clark was someone who was sort of well known in her day, but maybe isn't so famous now. In 2014, there was a copy of A Tale of Two Cities that was inscribed by Dickens to George Eliot that was offered for sale by a London bookseller for the equivalent of $350,000, which is a big difference. Of course, George Eliot is a lot more famous now. And I've been using this example for a few years now, and when I looked this up this year, it turns out that this copy that was inscribed to George Eliot was sold. I don't know for how much, but it was sold to this wealthy, philanthropist, book collecting couple who recently made a very large donation to the Folger Shakespeare Library in DC, and they built this new exhibition space. And the very first exhibit that they have there is treasures from their collection, which includes this copy of A Tale of Two Cities that was inscribed by George Eliot, which is how I know that they these are the people that bought it. Anyway, you can go see it. It's in DC now through January. So if you're interested in rare books, and they have other things too, really interesting collection. I haven't been to see it, but it sounds actually pretty cool. So there's monetary value, but that's not the only type of value, right? There's a value of association. So in our tales, you see the example, right? The association with George Eliot increases the monetary value of this item, right? But, we don't necessarily have to think of things of monetary value. So they can have, could just be super old, right? Value of age, or if it's rarity or uniqueness. It could have an aesthetic value, it's just a beautiful thing that you want to preserve. There's research value, which as a professional, is the value that I think about the most, which, is are researchers going to be interested in this item, and are they going to come to my particular repository to look for it, which are two different questions. And then there's sentimental value, which when we're talking about our family's collections of papers is probably the most important one. And there's no right or wrong answer here. There's no, archives police that's the arbiter of value. But this is just something for you to think about as you're making your own decisions. How do I want to spend my time and my money, and what do I actually want to preserve here, and what is the most important thing? And that's going to help make it a lot easier to make your preservation decisions and a sort of a game plan for your work. So I'm going to move on to talking about specific formats. So first up is paper. And paper was invented in China in the 3rd century, and then came to Europe in the 15th and 16th centuries. And prior to that, in Europe, they were using vellum or parchment, which are both derived from animal skins. And paper traditionally was made from rags. And here you have, a 19th century factory where all of these people are sorting through bags of rags. And we're talking about plant fibers, so cotton, linen, and hemp. And if you, have heard the term rag paper, it's because it's made from rags. And the way this works is the fibers would be, the rags would be sort of shredded and mixed with like water and other things, and then pressed and then spread over this very fine mesh screen. And then as it dries, you end up with paper. And here's an example of how the screen works. And the box itself is called a decal box. And if you've ever seen an old book, or sometimes even a new book that is sort of like a hardcover book that, is like fancy and it wants to be like a weighty tome, sometimes like the edges of that book are, instead of being smooth, they're kind of bumpy. You've seen that? That's called the decal edge. And it's either is or is meant to simulate the paper that was made on this kind of a box, because the edges wouldn't have been smooth until they were cut. So sometimes they cut the edges off the paper and they made the end smooth, and sometimes they left it kind of wavy, and then it's called decal edge. And sometimes when they make even a modern book, they do it like that to make it look fancy, I guess. Now, modern paper, of course, is made out of trees, right? And wood and trees have a substance in their cell walls called lignin. And lignin is the substance that oxidizes and causes modern papers to become brittle and turn brown and fragile and crumbly and everything that we kind of associate with, old paper. But rag paper doesn't do this, right? It doesn't have lignin in it, and it holds up a lot better. So all things being considered, if you have a letter from 1720 and one from 1920, and they've been stored under similar conditions, the one from 1720 is going to be in much better shape. It's going to be flexible and bendable, and maybe faded a little bit, maybe a little bit brown, but it's not going to have that very like crumbly, fragile crackliness to it. Modern paper is made in these big rolls, and this process hasn't really changed that much. Here's a picture of a 19th century paper factory and a modern one, and it kind of looks the same. And then, of course, paper is made into books. And so the way that this works is with old paper that they made in the sheets, you take the sheet and you would fold it. And if you fold it once and make 2 leaves, right? 4 pages, 2 leaves, that it would be called a folio. If you've seen that in a book description, a folio, that just means that the paper was folded once. If you fold it again, it makes 4 leaves, and that's called a quarto. Fold it again, it makes 8 leaves, that's an octavo, right? Everything like that. And then those bundles are called signatures, and then the signatures were then sewn together and then bound into a book. And we have an example of a book here. And I mean, I'll pass it around. You can see it's super flexible, even though this book is from 1820 something. And you can also see the signature marking. So there's the page number in the upper right-hand corner, but then down here, there's this letter, this alphanumeric code, and that's instructions to the bookbinder to which way the pages go, how the signature should be bound together, because it didn't go by the page number, because it could be paginated any sort of way. But down there you can see. So you can take a look at that. And of course, modern books, they're still folded together. Your signatures are much bigger, right? And the pages are, but they're still folded together and they're generally glued together, right, into a book. Now, in the pre-industrial era, your printer and your bookbinder, your bookseller your bookbinder really were two different people. So you didn't buy a book from the publisher as an actual book. The books were sold to booksellers or bookbinders, and then they bound it. And so when you think of sort of an old world library where it has all of these like, leather bound volumes and they all look the same, which is very different from, a modern library where, all the covers are different. It's because you would have been able to have your books bound, to match to your specifications. You would go to a bookseller or bookbinder and say, I want this bound in this kind of leather, and I want these kinds of end pages. And so they're all going to be different, even if they were made at the same time. And then I thought this was pretty interesting. This was something that I was looking at for work, and it's a note to the bookbinder, and it says, and this was a book from Cook's Voyages to the Pacific Ocean, and it has these beautiful plates in it. And it says, some people who are buying this book might want to have the plates separate, and maybe they don't want the plates, there's places inside the book where you can put the plates, but maybe they want to have all the plates separate, bound, separately. So, just be aware of that, because they're going to tell you exactly how they want it bound. So you can find traces of the way that this worked in older books when you find them. And also it's something to consider that sometimes when you find plates from books, like for sale, kind of, like a flea market type thing, and you kind of always think, well, they were torn out of books. It's not necessarily the case. They may never have been bound into the book in the first place. So just something to keep in mind. So as I said, our main issue with paper is mono paper, which becomes very fragile and brittle, and that again has to do with the materials that they're made from. And so when we're talking about how to store these materials, how to handle them, the first thing we want to do is make sure things are relatively clean. So if things that are sometimes when we're dealing with older materials, they can be dirty or dusty. So if you have like a very soft bristle brush or a kind of magnetic cloth, you can clean things up if you have a lot of dirt. If not, you don't have to worry about it, right? You want to make sure that your documents aren't folded. So if you have like letters and envelopes, you want to take those out and unfold them, because anytime you have something with like a crease or a fold, that creates a point where there's a weakness, and that's where if it is going to break, that's where it's going to break. Oh, and here's an example. There's also from work, which I just thought was kind of cool. These, pieces of paper had been stored together for, God knows how long. And when you took them apart, you could see like the different types of paper had deteriorated at different rates and left this like pattern on the piece on the bottom. And so in a case like this, if you wanted to maintain all of these things together, you could interleave your sheets with a sheet of acid-free paper, or we have like acid-free tissue you could put in between if you really wanted to keep all of those things together to prevent, further discoloration. And pass it around. That's just tissue paper, but that's acid-free tissue paper. And then, I saw this. This is new that they have here for us. I haven't seen this one before, but we've got this crazy letter from that's in Dad's shape, right? And it seems what they've done is they made a little like little mini folder here, and they put all the little scraps in here to keep them together, right? Which is one way to handle something like this, right? So that way you keep it all together, and if you don't lose any little parts. I would say if this was something that I was dealing with, I would probably try to flatten it as best as possible. And if it was important, you could also maybe put it into like a sheet of Mylar, like this, just like plastic sleeve, and then, and it's open, it's on, it stays open, right? It's not encapsulated, it stays open, and you can put it in there, and then you could even put little pieces back in there if you wanted to, and it'll hold it together, and then you might be able to actually read some of it, and you'd be able to handle it a little bit better. So that's something you could do, or you could just put it like that in a folder. Yeah, so, I guess we can pass that on too. Back. So what we don't want to do is laminate our items, right? Because lamination seems like a great idea, right? Because it's sort of doing the same thing as this Mylar sleeve I was talking about, but it keeps it all together. And we have some examples here of Mylar, or sorry, of lamination. Okay. There you go. So lamination was invented in the 1930s. And basically what you're doing is you're making a sandwich of your document in between two pieces of plastic. And then there's also heat that's applied, right? And this was used very widely from the 1940s to the 1980s. The Library of Congress has Thomas Jefferson's draft of the Declaration of Independence, which they laminated. Where I work at the National Anthropological Archives, we have Sitting Bull's pictorial autobiography, which is his life in pictures that he drew, laminated. We also have drawings of Red Horse, who was at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and they're amazing. They're beautiful. They're at least 3 foot wide pictures of the whole battle, all told from Native perspective, laminated. And as our curator of North American ethnology says, you could use them as a placemat, right? It's like a tragedy. It's terrible. So why is this bad? So like I said, it's like a sandwich, and it basically it violates our cardinal rule of do no harm, because you can't undo this. And they've tried. The one at the Declaration of Independence at the Library of Congress, they tried to delaminate it, and now it lives in this special like chamber where it's, because it's so fragile, it has like these like inert gases in there. I mean, as I said, I'm not a chemist, I don't really understand it all, but it's basically they did something not so great there. And it can't be undone. It affects the actual nature of the paper itself, because you're filling in like the pores and the spaces in between the fibers with plastic. Your paper is still going to degrade, and it may even be sped up by the adhesives and the heat process that was in there, but now it's trapped forever in this plastic sandwich. So we don't want to laminate our items. If you have things that are laminated, you have things that are laminated, basically. You don't have a lot of options. So tape seems like a great idea, right? You gotta, your item is in two pieces, you just tape it back together. But what happens is that over time, the adhesive in the tape is going to dry up and it's gonna fail, and your plastic tape is just gonna come right off. And then you're gonna be left with a very ugly brown stain where your tape was. And page is still in 2 pieces, and now it's even more damaged because of the action of the adhesives that have been applied to it for however many years. So we don't want to use tape either. Like I said, what we want to do is maybe keep things together. We can use Mylar sheets, maybe if it's something that's very important that we want to keep together like that. And you can also, if it's something that you very much want to repair, you can engage a conservator who will be able to attach it back together for you. But it's probably not something you want to attempt on your own. So the other thing we want to do is remove all traces of metal from our collection, because it's going to rust. So we want to remove staples and paper clips and binders. A lot of times people used to use straight pins like for sewing to hold documents together, and you want to just remove all of that from your collections because it leaves a very disgusting mess. Same thing with rubber bands and things like that. I think we have these examples. So basically they get dried up and they get sticky. So we don't need to pass those around. how do you remove your staples? What you don't want to use is sort of an office staple remover, because if you're, I'm sure we've all had the experience where you try to remove it and like half of the paper comes off with it, right? I mean, I've never been able to use one of those successfully. I don't know how they're supposed to work. What you want to use is a what we call a spatula, which is this little thing. Is that around? And the way that this works is, so you flip your document upside down, right? And then you put your spatula under the staple on one side and then on the other, so that the staple ends are straight up. And then you flip it back over and then you pull the staple straight out. And that way you're not ripping apart the paper and you're getting the staple out clean. So now you're saying, well, if I remove all my staples and my paper clips and everything, then how am I gonna hold my documents together? So you have a couple of options. And I think the first one is to decide, do I really need to hold these documents together at all? A lot of times, I think, we staple things together, just sort of absentmindedly without really thinking whether or not that staple is necessary. And you may not need a staple. If it's the only thing in your folder and it's not going to get out of order and it's not going to get mixed in with other things, then maybe you don't need a fastener. So you really want to think about that. But if you do, and there are times when you absolutely do need a fastener, you have a couple of options. So the first is you could replace your paper clip with a stainless steel or a plastic paper clip, and I have this one. And the way you want to do that is you get like a strip of acid-free paper, and you put it in between your staple and your documents so that it doesn't, so that the paper clip rather doesn't come in direct contact with your documents, and it protects it a little bit, and then you can keep it all together. The downside of this is that if you use a lot of these, especially the plastic ones, they can really bulk up your collection. So if you imagine that you have like a whole bunch of documents and there's a whole bunch of like paper clips, especially if you have, you put them all generally in the upper left-hand corner. So when you put it in your folder, that part is going to be a lot thicker than the rest of it. And then it's going to kind of create a mess. And then like you kind of start to like have a pattern. Well, maybe I'll put one here and then the next one I'll put one here. It just gets very messy. And then they can also get attached to each other, right? The whole thing gets very, they come apart, you lose them. But there's definitely a time and a place, and this is absolutely an acceptable solution, but there are some downsides. Another option is you can get a piece of acid-free paper and you just fold it in half and you put your documents inside, and it sort of keeps it together, a little mini folder inside your folder. And then the benefit to this is that you can then write on it, like letter from, Grandma Sally to, Aunt, Susie, and then you can write the date and you can write how many pages it is so that you'll know if something got lost. And you can even, if there were any enclosures, 2 photos, like whatever, you can write whatever you want on the, on your little, your piece of acid-free paper that you're holding it together. The downside to this is that acid-free paper is pretty expensive. And if you're doing this a lot, you're really going to bulk up your collection because you're adding all this additional paper. And so if space is at a premium, then maybe you don't want to, add, reams and reams of extra paper just to keep all these things together. But again, it's all a judgment call. That's up to you how you want to approach it.
Question.
Yeah.
On the previous slide, you said put polyester under like a paper clip, but previously you talked about Mylar. What's the difference between polyester and?
Oh, yeah. So I stole this image from somewhere else. And it happened to say polyester, but that is Mylar. Mylar is a brand name. So it's, it's sort of like Kleenex, you just call it Mylar, but I think it's maybe owned by 3M. I don't know. So yeah, so that's just, it's the same thing.
Okay.
Yeah, so you keep all these together. Yeah. All right. Oh, and then, so I don't know how many historic faxes we have, but a thermal paper, which could be printer paper or generally like this fax paper, the ink will fade. And as you can see here, and I think we have this one here somewhere, the you can see how the printed part has totally faded and it's really hard to read, but the ink that was done presumably at the same time or shortly thereafter is still very very legible. And so if you have any documents like this that you wanna be saving, I would recommend making a preservation photocopy of it. So basically, you just make a photocopy onto acid-free paper. And the standard is that you should be able to make a photocopy, a legible photocopy from your photocopy, right? Because you want to be able to reproduce the thing that you have reproduced. So if you make a photocopy and if you photocopy that photocopy, you wouldn't be able to read it, you should try again. Make it darker, like, play with it until you can get it like that. And you could also, make a digital, take a picture of it if you wanted to, but, having a physical, like, eye-readable copy is probably your best bet. All right, mold. So mold is something we want to take really seriously, because it can make you very sick. And when I was in grad school, the conservator at the university, his name was Jim Canary, and they used to call him the canary in the coal mine because he had developed such a sensitivity to mold over the course of his career that if he was in the room with mold, he would break out into a rash. So it was great, if you had a question, is this mold? You just bring it to Jim and you could tell, but that's not something you really want to cultivate professionally or in your private life. So you want to take mold very seriously. Mold can be active and it can be dormant or inactive. So the first thing you want to do is don't smell it. Everybody wants to smell it first. You don't want to do that because that's obviously bad for you. If you take like a gloved finger and it's smeary, then you have active mold. If it's kind of dusty, then it might be dirt, it might be mold, inactive or inert mold, and that's a little bit easier to deal with. So if you have active mold, it's smeary, it's moldy, the first thing you want to do is separate anything that you think is contaminated from everything else, because you don't want your mold infestation to spread. That's your main concern. So you want to separate it, and then I personally would think real hard about whether I want to keep these things because it's going to be a process. So if you decide, oh, these are really important, I want to keep them, your best bet is to wrap them. Either you could put them in plastic if you're going to freeze them immediately, but you don't want to put something moldy in a plastic bag and then kind of think about what you're going to do with it for a couple of weeks. You want to immediately put it in the freezer. You can also wrap it in parchment or wax paper or anything like that. And again, put it in the freezer, and then you can wait until, and then that should make the mold, dormant or inactive, and then you can decide what to do with it. You really want to have, PPE when you do this kind of thing, at the very least a mask, gloves. If you're going to deal with a, conservator or somebody that really specializes in mold remediation, they will have like the full thing, eye protection, suit, they're going to have a ventilation hood, they're going to take it very, very seriously because they don't, want to develop a lifelong sensitivity to mold or respiratory conditions or whatever. If it's the kind you can kind of, it's very dusty and you can brush it off and clean it very well. There are specialty vacuums, but I would not use a household vacuum because, you're going to kind of vacuum up your whole book and destroy the whole thing. Professionals will have a vacuum that has a special filter and has a very, specialized brush and end that is gentle. But you can brush off with with a very soft bristle brush and try to clean it off a little bit. But really, I would be very, very cautious because you don't want it to spread and you don't want to get sick. And again, I think the most important thing is to decide really how much you really need to preserve this thing and what you want to do with it. But that's how we should approach that. So we have our papers, we have it all organized where we want, which is a different discussion. We have everything unfolded and cleaned up. And what we want to do is we want to put it in acid-free folders, in boxes, use sleeves, whether they're paper sleeves, like acid-free paper that's folded, or Mylar sleeves, things like that. And then we want to make sure that we fill our folders. Now, we don't have to fill our folders all the way necessarily. You can put only a few items in a folder. But what and this is pet peeve. The folders all have these little indentations on the bottom, and you really do need to use these. And like fold it, kind of like this to the width of your items. So that it sits in the box like, like on the bottom here. right? You want everything to be even, because if you have a situation like this where, you know, everything is kind of like in there over time, it's like tectonic plates and folders get subsumed under other folders and everything gets warped and smushed in your box, and you don't want that. You want everything to sit up nice and straight and even. If you have a box and everything doesn't fit in there, you want to use a spacer, which, you know, they sell spacers, but, you know, you could use extra folders, you could use other, you know, materials, as long as, you know, you're not using acid-free kind of materials. And, you want to, very importantly, use them the right way, because there was some madman, that worked in my repository who, I can't tell you how many of these boxes, but like down here, like, they put them in all backwards, you see? Like, what is this? You see, the flat side goes against your papers to prop them up, right? Like this, right? So keep everything standing up straight. But this person went and hundreds of boxes, they're all like this, where this is the complete opposite. It would have been better if you didn't put anything in there, right? And then they'd just be slumped this way, but now they're all curved over. So if you're gonna use a spacer, you know, think about how you're using it and make sure it's in there the right way. All right, so books. So books are meant to be stored like books, you know, also straight up and down. You want to use bookends, right? Like up here is not so great. Here we're looking good, right? We want our books to be straight up and down. Well, if we have to store a book in a way that's not like this, we absolutely don't want to do it like this. And this includes if you're if you have to box a bunch of books, like even for moving or anything like that. If you have to put a book like on its end, you want to do it the other way with the spine down, because the weight of the text block is going to pull it right out of the case, right? So you want to store books up unless they're very large, like, you know, like a coffee table book or an atlas or something like that, that can be stored flat, you know, obviously. But books that are meant to be stored upright should be stored upright. And if you're going to stack them, you don't want to stack more than 2 or 3 at a time, because one, it creates additional weight, and also, you know, every time you want to get one, you got to be moving everything, and you want to minimize the number of times that you're touching everything. When you want to retrieve a book, you know, the way most of us do it is you just sort of grab the book, but that's not the right way to do it if you're dealing with like a rare book or a valuable book. What you should do is take 2 fingers and you push in the book on either side of the book that you want, and then you can pull your book out from the center. Right, because otherwise you're going to get like, you know, the top of the book is going to have a little bit where it's going to wear there. You're going to cause a problem. You know, and then if you do have a problem with your books where the covers are, you know, fallen off, you have a broken spine. Again, this is maybe something where you want to engage. If you want to have this fixed, maybe you want to engage a conservator, or you can do something like that little book that I passed around before. You know, have a little, you know, 4 flat enclosure made for it, and it just sort of sits in there. And these you can buy and just sort of cut up yourself for your book. And that'll help protect the book and give it some support. Sometimes you'll encounter books with what's known as red rot, which is when the leather that was used to, you know, bind the book has degraded, and it creates this kind of red, dusty mess that gets all over everything. And it was used, you know, find it a lot with like old ledger books and things like that, where they're not using maybe the highest quality leather, and they were sort of cheaply made, or like old diaries, things like that. And it just makes a mess. It makes everything dirty and gross. When I was working at GW, and we were working on a project where we were transferring the records of the Riggs Bank, and these were all like huge, like these big ledger books, and we had to go over there and wrap them all up, and they all had red rot. And we were using, you know, we were using masks and gloves, and we had the coats, and we had everything. And within a few days, I was coughing up red. It was so gross. It was disgusting. So again, you could use that kind of enclosure to keep it together, and it'll help keep all that kind of mess sealed in there. You can also, there's something called like Cellugel that you can buy that you can apply to it, which helps seal it up a little bit. But just something to be aware of that does happen with older leather bound books. So as I said, we want to, you know, shelf our books properly. We can use big boxes. You can also have like fancy like this, like these custom boxes made. You know, if you have something very special. but you can buy those sorts of 4 flap enclosures, that you can make yourself. And, just want to make sure that things are, supported if they need additional support. And then finally, when we're talking about this, again, bringing us back to what exactly it is that we're preserving. So here's an example of a ledger book that was for some sort of business, and there had been a fire in the warehouse of this building, and this book was been damaged. And you can see it has a big burn in it. And when we're talking about preservation, conservation, we could contract a conservator to come and to replace the cover of this book, right? And they could even go and fill in the holes in the burnt pages. I mean, they can't replace the information that was lost, but they could make those pages, they could remove the burnt parts, and they could make it all smooth and put in, like a blank paper in there, fill in the hole, and they could certainly replace the cover and, make it look, like new again. And you could do that. But by doing that, you're losing some of the evidence of the history of this business, because this book was in this fire and it survived. And now you can see that in the book. So when we're talking about what we're preserving and what we're actually trying to, conserve, and what is the point that we're trying to return back to, and what are we losing if we're making too many changes? And that's just something to think about, right? All right. So sometimes we have like very large items that are rolled, and generally you want to store things flat. Now, I mean, we don't all have map cases in our house, right? And you don't place necessarily to store large flat objects, but that would be the ideal situation. And if you have something that's been rolled up and it's relatively pliable, what you should do is you take it, you lay it out like on a big table, and then you can put some, assuming it's still, I mean, if you just unroll it and it's flat, then you're done. But if it's still curving a little bit, then you roll it out on a big table, and you can put some sort of weights on the corner. So maybe put some folders or something underneath to protect it. They sell book weights. You don't need book weights. You can use anything kind of heavy, like I mean, I don't know if it's a full book anymore, but something like that, a dictionary, something a little bit heavy to weight it down. And if it's after a few days, it should, be flat, and then you can put it in a folder and store it, in your at-home back case or wherever you want to keep it. If it doesn't, if you just try to unroll it and it like starts to crack and it's kind of brittle, then what you can do is you can try this do-it-yourself humidification process. Now, I personally have never done this, and this kind of scares me a little bit, I don't know, but this is totally legitimate practice, and you can try it. And basically what you do is you get a like a bin, like kind of like an underbed storage bin, right? And then you need like a plastic kind of grate type thing. And then you get a towel that is damp, not wet, damp, right? A little bit damp. You put that on the bottom of your bin, and you put your grate on top, and then you put your rolled item on top of the grate. You don't want it to touch the towel. Everybody needs the wet. So you just want it to be in there, and then you close it up. And then you pay attention. So you don't do this and then like go on vacation for, 3 weeks and then come back. You don't want to do that, right? You want to like check it like every day. And the minute it starts to be like, oh, I can unroll this now, then you take it out and you roll it out flat and, weight it down. And that's how you would humidify it. You never want to do this with a photograph. This is only for paper. Photographs, you need to talk to a conservator. You need more equipment than you're going to have and more expertise than you have. And I don't think it's that, complicated really to unroll a photograph if you do know what you're doing. When I was Library of Congress, I worked for the Veterans History Project. We had a lot of regimental photos, and they always came rolled, they're big panoramic. And the photo conservator would take as many as we had and use them as like intern projects. So I think it's relatively straightforward, but it's not something you're gonna do yourself. All right, so newspapers. So a lot of times, we have old newspapers. And generally, like in archives, newspapers, we don't really keep. And clippings is one of the few things that we will make a preservation photocopy, which again is a photocopy on acid-free paper that you could then reproduce, and then discard the original. And it's one of the few formats that's a very, very common accepted practice, and that's just how it's done. Newspaper paper is highly acidic. It's an ephemeral medium, and it's in most cases. The newspapers are going to be available elsewhere, and they don't necessarily add that much to the collection. Now, Again, I'm not the archives police. I don't, if you want to save old newspapers, that's your business. And again, you could store them flat, again, in your, at-home map case. And if you don't have those, you can they sell boxes specifically for newspapers. They come for broadsides, they come for tabloid size, and you can wrap them in acid-free tissue paper, and you could keep them, like this. I would probably not try not to touch them too much, like keep them in the box as much as possible. All right, so that was paper books. And then moving on to, yes.
On a leather-bound book, is it important to periodically turn the pages to keep it kind of exercised? And I was told that you can also use some sort of lubricant like shoe polish to keep the binding supple. Is that something you would agree with?
I'm not a rare book librarian, and it's been a long time since I took a class in rare books. But I don't remember there being any discussion of exercising the books. I don't think I would apply shoe polish. I'd be very concerned about that. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that doesn't sound like a thing.
There was a recommendation by the bindery that actually rebound the book.
Well, then sure. I mean, if they know what
And I
they're
read
doing.
elsewhere that you shouldn't do it, just like you're.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, they may know more about what they use, and I mean, I would be hesitant to just use any old shoe polish. Like, that sounds like a little
They have a
suspicious to me.
specific
Yeah, if they have a
type.
specific kind, then sure. I mean, that may be a thing. I don't know. I mean, I guess you could try, and then if it seems like, I mean, I would say I would probably look at it, and if it's getting very stiff and it feels like it needs a little something, then maybe you could. But I think really the overarching, if it's not broke, don't fix it, if there's no problems, then don't make problems, I would say. But I don't know, All right, photograph. So, photography was invented in the 1820s, and there have been a lot of different formats and different methods used to make photographs over time. And I think the Balch offers a class on the history of photographs and photograph preservation, right? So they'll go into a lot more detail about all of that there. But basically, when you're dealing with a photograph, you're dealing with layers. So there's a background layer, which can be, paper, like in a modern photo. It can be metal, like a tintype, glass, like a glass negative or a lantern slide, plastic, like when we talk about negative, and then there's an emulsion layer with the image, right? And a lot of the, damage can be from changes in your environment and things like that, and temperature and humidity. And really, when we talk about photographs, one of the biggest problems is labeling and not knowing what's in our photographs. And when we don't know what's in our photographs, then we've lost all of the informational value, right? Because this could be a picture of anything at any time, right? So, we just have some examples of different kinds of photograph damage. We have a big old fingerprint, which is not great. This is, the original negative, this very famous photograph, and you can see it's cracked. And then we have emulsion damage, which is usually caused, as I said, by changes in temperature and humidity. So when we talk about labeling, we want to label our photos, but not like this. You want to avoid using ink and a pen you want to label on the back of your photograph, obviously. And you want to avoid using ink because over time the ink will run through and you'll be able to see it on the image. And you want to avoid a sort of a normal like #2 pencil because it's too hard. And again, you can create an impression on the image side. And generally what we use are these blue photo marking pencils, which are very soft, which makes them somewhat difficult to sharpen and write clearly with as well. But that's, a different problem. And so you want to label your photos so that people in the future know who these people are. Because I know, especially, in my family, I have pictures and I don't know who these people are. And there's very few people around who might recognize them. And then you've lost a lot of the value of your family history. And then for photographs, we generally try to sleeve them in Mylar. And you can buy Mylar sleeves and they come in a whole bunch of different configurations for different sizes of photos. And some of these to pass around. And the benefit of that is that you can handle and see the photos, because when we deal with photographs and negatives as well, we want to use gloves, and we don't want to touch them with our bare hands, because you can leave fingerprints that do damage the emulsion in the photo, and then you get the fingerprint, which you don't want. And so Mylar allows you to view the photographs without actually touching them. If you have lots and lots and lots of photos, Mylar is expensive, right? And it's time consuming, you know, to put things in all those sleeves. If you have lots and lots of photos, you can buy, they sell, you know, acid-free photo envelopes, which are, you know, just like regular, you know, envelopes, they come in different sizes. And if you have like, you know, rolls and rolls and rolls of film that maybe you haven't sorted through, you know, but you want to sort of rehouse them and take them out of the developer envelopes and things like that, you can put them into these envelopes and then store them like that. You could also, they make like boxes that are sort of like shoebox shaped, they're called shoe boxes. And, but again, they're acid free, and you can put your photos in there like that as well. If you have a lot and you don't want to necessarily sleeve all of them, that would be an acceptable solution. And then, you know, of course, we keep our photos in albums and scrapbooks. And a lot of times when people, you know, I meet people and, you know, they, you know, I tell them I'm an archivist, and they say, oh, I love scrapbooking. I don't really like scrapbooking all that much. And I think, you know, a lot of archivists, you know, you kind of have a love-hate relationship with scrapbooks, because they can be like, you know, amazing. They're these beautiful little curated collections, and they're very, very interesting, and they're visually interesting, and they're certainly fun to display and look at. But from a preservation perspective, they're very challenging. And they can, you know, have a lot of different formats, and then that's what makes them interesting, right? Is that all the different formats in there. So you have paper, and a lot of times the paper is paper that's, you know, of an ephemeral nature. You know, you have like newspaper clippings, or, you know, ticket stubs, things that were not meant to last a long time, that are not like high quality materials. You know, you have photographs, you can have artwork, you can have, you know, biological materials like pressed flowers or human hair, you know, all of these different things. I once had a scrapbook that had a whole pocket watch glued into it, right? And then it's bound into a book, which is an additional format, right? And so from a preservation perspective, they could be a little tricky. And honestly, the best situation, if your scrapbook is in good shape, you know, the best thing to do is to get a box for it, a custom box, and put it in the box. And then, you know, try not to touch it too much is always the best advice. Just don't touch it too much, right? You just put it in the box and you keep it like that. And you can always, you know, photograph it in a way so that you can see it. If it's in really, really bad shape and it's falling apart and it's really not salvageable as a, you know, as an item, then generally what we would do is we would photograph it as it is, and it's as much as possible to, you know, keep a sense of what it looked like as a book, and then you would disassemble it and store everything separately in folders, right? So that you're at least preserving the items that were in the scrapbook without being able to save the scrapbook itself. But you know, if your scrapbook is in, or your album is in like really good shape and it's fine, and you know, the pages are pliable and the photos look good and everything's fine, then that's fine. You know, you can still get a box for it, but you don't necessarily have to if it looks good. And you can just keep it and you can use it, and that's fine. So it really is a matter of, you know, assessing what, because it's dependent on the materials that were used to make the album, right? But if you have one of these, which a lot of us have these, right? This you want to deal with. This you want to deal with as soon as possible. So these are these magnetic albums that are really popular, like I guess in the 80s, 90s. And they turn yellow, as we all know. I can't tell you how old I was before I realized they didn't originally come in this color. Like, you know, like they're supposed to be white, not brown like this. And if you have photos in here, most of the time it's pretty easy to get them out. I've only ever encountered these a few times where the pages have really, really been stuck together. But if you can pull the plastic back and take your photos out, I would encourage you to do that as a first project. If you can't get the pages out, then you might need some help from a conservator or someone to come and help you loosen that up. You don't want to, you know, force it. But these are pretty bad and were very, very common. And then, of course, we want to, frame and display our items in our home. And again, like anything else, this is great, but it does create some or present some preservation problems. So your main concerns are the materials that you're using, to both to, in your frame and your mats and whatever other kind of backing material you have in there, and also light exposure, right? So you want, ideally, again, I mean, in an ideal world, if preservation was your absolute number one concern, what I would recommend would be that you make a high quality copy of your, your photographs or, whatever else it is, your documents, and put the copy in a frame, and then keep the originals, safely in your box, in your folder, somewhere else. But, we don't necessarily want to do that, right? We want to actually display our real, whatever it is, artwork or, photographs. So you just want to make sure that you're using, acid-free materials, acid-free mats, that the things aren't necessarily glued in there, that they're being held, in different ways, and that you can also have UV protectant glass. And think about where you're displaying items in your home as well, like maybe not on a wall that gets like 6 hours of direct sunlight, a day is probably not the best place. So, just think about that. I know that conservators take having things on display and like this very seriously, where I'm now, we're part of the Smithsonian, but we have one item in our collection that's on display in the museum, and it's a book, and someone on our staff goes every 3 months and turns the page, because it can't be on display for more than 3 months at a time, and this is in a, controlled setting, and they still take it very, very seriously. So you need to keep that in mind. All right, so we know what exactly what we're doing, and we are, ready to go. This is, a lovely, office space. I, wish my house looked that nice, but it's not suitable for this kind of work. So, it's not the kind of thing you do with like, your big cup of coffee. You want to have not have food and drink nearby. Right, obviously, sources of open flame, plants, flowers, and things that are going to make a mess. And you really want to be able to spread out, because the worst thing is if you're working in a very cramped space, and then you're gonna, you're not going to be able to spread your things out and see what you have and be able to, make sure that everything is unfolded and nice and neat and, organized. So ideally, you have a big conference table, but of course, we usually don't have that in our house. But like a dining table or something like that. Would be great, just so that you can, spread out and keep everything, organized. So supply. So I talked about a lot of these already. So just sort of going around here, this is like a soft brush that you could use for, if you have like dirty, dusty kind of things for cleaning. Pencils, you don't want to avoid marking your folders with pen or, markers or anything like that. Pencil is best because you don't want to accidentally write all over your stuff. And then of course the blue pencil for photos. You want a high quality eraser, because, you don't want to just use the eraser on the back of the pencil, because that just makes a mess. As anybody who's ever used a pencil knows. So a high quality eraser that's not gonna leave a mark. This thing is called a bone folder, and you can use it if you're doing, making like face boxes, or, for making your folder creases really nice, or just for anything that needs to be really, needs a really good crease. It's really satisfying. We have the spatula, which which I passed around for your staples. Magnifying glass, which is helpful, for reading and making sure that we can see everything. And then these are book weights, which I mean, you can get, you don't necessarily need, but they can be helpful if you have, like an older book that maybe is a little fragile and you want to either give it a little bit of support to hold it open, probably not gonna have big book cradles in your house, but you could use them like that, or you could use it to hold, you put it on top or underneath, you could use it just for like a little bit of support. And then, of course, you want to have, your folders and your boxes. when you're thinking about your, where you're gonna buy these things, I would recommend that you, go through a, library or archives supplier and avoid places like Michael's or, like Office Depot or things like that. Because you're gonna see the terms like acid-free and lignin-free and all of that when they're advertising materials, but there's like no, real regulation of these terms. So, they could be selling you anything. I'm not saying they're selling you something wrong or but you don't really know. And I can tell you that when I was at Library of Congress, they do one order of supplies for the entire Library of Congress for like the for like the manuscript type and archives divisions. They do one order for like the whole library once a year, right? Once a year. And 1 year and then they test it. So if they take it to their own, the conservation lab tests everything, in samples. And 1 year, all the Mylar failed the testing. And they sent it all back. And there was like no Mylar for like, I don't know how many months. It was complete craziness. So if people are selling this stuff to the Library of Congress and it's failing their testing, I mean, so, you want to buy from a reputable supplier because that's the best you can do because you're not going to be doing your own testing, right? But just something to consider. So make sure you have good quality materials. And I have on the handout, there's like the websites for different places where they're all places you can buy it. And then there was this article in the New York Times last year, and it was really interesting, and I encourage you to read it. So we talked about gloves a little bit. When you don't want to be using gloves when you're dealing with your paper and your books. You want to use your gloves with photos. And I can pass around. We have a pair of, these are like cotton gloves. You can also use like a nitrile glove. Those are good too, for most things. And so anyway, so there's this whole article in the Times last spring about how you shouldn't use gloves and how nobody believes anybody when you say you shouldn't use gloves. And, for years, people have been saying, please don't use gloves. And there's all this pushback because people see on, if you ever watch like those shows, like, the genealogy shows on, on TV, they're always using the gloves. And it's like, you watch it, you're like, why? Anyway, nobody uses these gloves. And then you read the comments and the comments are like, this article's wrong. You should be using gloves. And it's like, you can't win. But anyway, I would totally, if you're interested, you can check this out. There's a really good discussion about why it's unnecessary and dangerous to wear gloves when you're dealing with paper. And the reason is that you lose a lot of dexterity in your hands when you're, especially, cotton gloves, and it's very easy to tear things apart and, you lose that. So you could just use your hands. You want to keep your hands clean, right? Make sure your hands are washed. Maybe don't like slather on tons of like greasy lotion before you're going to do this. But, if you have clean hands, you're fine. You don't need to be worrying about, the oils in your hands and this kind of thing, unless you're dealing with photos. Photos is different. So the Balch offers this archives preservation kit, which I think is actually kind of nice because it gives you a little sample of all of the supplies. And so you get, and it's like over here, you get the legal size document box, which is like this. So, these are the kind of boxes that we tend to use in archives. You can also, or this is like a half size, this is like a standard size box. You can also get an acid-free, like a record carton, more like a standard, like a banker's box, so that's fine too. They're heavier and, but that's totally fine. These can be, they're like a little tippy when you use them, but it's really up to you what kind of box. You don't need this kind of box. But anyway, this comes with the box. You get folders, a sample of Mylar sleeves, the interleaving paper, which is the tissue that I passed around, one of those spatulas, a pencil, eraser, and a pair of cotton gloves. And it can be nice to sort of test out the supplies before you invest because they can be very expensive. And this way, you can have a sense of, like, like what works for you, whether maybe because they also sell them in letter size, maybe you want letter size, maybe you don't have anything with legal size. You don't need to buy legal size boxes, things like that. So it's something for you to think about. And then there's also one for photos specifically. And the photo one comes with, basically, it's sort of the same, it just comes with, I think it should come with more and different kinds of Mylar. And when it comes with different So basically the same thing, but more photo specific. So something to consider. And so, so once you have everything and it's all in your boxes and you're ready to go, then what do you do with it? So, you don't need a climate controlled storage facility, right? You can just keep this in your house, relative comfortable, temperature, and humidity is fine. The most important thing is to avoid fluctuations in temperature and humidity. That is worse. It's better if it's consistently a little too hot than it being a little too hot one time of year and then like it goes back and forth, right? That's much worse. Just consistent is best. And for that reason, you want to avoid attics and basements and places where the temperature and humidity changes, like seasonally. You want to avoid sources of heat and water for obvious reasons. Sunlight, artificial lights. You don't want to put storage containers right on the floor. If you have like a flood, paper, it's like a sponge, it'll soak everything up. So keep something raised on shelving, in a cabinet, something like that. And, keep the area clean, vacuum and dust and keep it clean, and it'll all go a long way. But you don't need, freezer, you don't need any sort of special equipment in that regard. And then I have a whole bunch of websites, and again, these are on the handout, so you don't need to write these down. But both the National Archives and the Library of Congress have pages dedicated to preservation. And they both have a little bit that's aimed at a general audience. A lot of it is for professionals, but they do have pages about family histories and for the general public. The Northeast Documents Conservation Center is a really great resource. They have a series of technical leaflets which are aimed for librarians, but they're mainly for, they're for sort of generalist librarians. They're not for specialists. It's not necessarily for people who are experts. And so it explains in very basic language what to do and how to care for these types of items. The American Institute for the Conservation of Historic and Artistic, I didn't change this. This is actually it's the same organization, but it's right on the handout, but I forgot to change it on the slide. But they have two websites. One is basically, this is an organization for conservators. So if you're looking to find a conservator or anything like that, you can go here. They also have a really good page about caring for your treasures. It's the same page, just the address is different. And it covers other things that we didn't talk about. So things that are like objects, textiles, architectural preservation, all sorts of things like that, because they're a much larger organization. They deal with a lot more than archivists do. And so they have a lot of information there. And then if you're really into sort of the nitty-gritty of conservation and that really interests you, they have a wiki, which it used to be this, but it's a new thing, and it's a wiki, and they have a lot of really detailed information about conservation, and that's sort of where the conservators go to talk amongst themselves. But if you get really into it, then that's a place to get information. Archival Methods is a website that sells materials, but they have a really good, and I don't know anything about the products that they sell, so I can't really speak to that, but they have a really good blog that explains in layman's terms and is directed again at a general audience, and has a lot of really good information about what to do at home. And then something that I use and I think could be helpful is this preservation self-assessment program collection ID guide, which if you have something but you don't know what it is, like this happens a lot, like it's a weird format. And they have everything, which is paper and photos and AV and all sorts of different formats. And it tells you, helps you identify things, because it'll tell you what years it was in production and, what the manufacturers of these things were and what type of things. And then it gets into more detail about, what they actually used, what type of materials they used, and then how exactly you should preserve them and what they need specifically for these types of formats. And so that can be really helpful if you have something and you don't really know what it is, what kind of photograph is this, what was used to produce this document. And so that's basically it. Again, our major ideas, our takeaways are, do no harm, right? And we should always be thinking about the long-term consequences of what we're doing. And just because something seems like a really good short-term solution doesn't mean it's a good idea in the long term. thinking through its intrinsic versus informational value and what it is that we're trying to preserve. Making sure we're keeping our things in an environment that's cool and dry and dark, consistent. Using acid-free materials. And then making sure that things are properly and clearly labeled. I mean, especially when we're dealing with our family materials, and maybe the case where we know the most about these things, and when we're gone, nobody else is really going to be able to identify them. And it could be beautiful and, you know, neatly organized and preserved, but if our, you know, the people who come after us can't interpret them, then we haven't really done our job completely. So that's really something to consider. And yes, oh,
So yeah, so our virtual audience, Teresa asked, any suggestions on how to store a quilt made by a grandmother over 80 years ago and is starting to deteriorate? I had someone suggest cutting it apart and framing it for all the grandchildren / great grandchildren.
all right, well, I don't really know anything about textiles. That is not something you know, that's not my skill set or my training at all whatsoever. So I can't really speak to the best environment for that. I think that if you want to, I mean, that's up to you. If you want to cut it up and distribute it among your family, that's 100% your call. I think that would be, I mean, from a preservation perspective, I can't, again, I don't know. I mean, I think you could probably get a box for it, and, you know, there are, you know, tissues and things like that. You could wrap it up, and you probably don't want to fold it. You want to have it kind of rolled in a way so that you're not, you know, creating creases and things like that in it. I mean, that's the best I could tell you about how to store any sort of fabric. But whether or not you want to frame it or cut it up, or, you know, that's more of a decision about what you want to do with it, not how you want to do with it, I guess. Yeah, I don't know if that was helpful.
And then one more, any suggestions on preserving a Bible?
Right, okay, so, yeah, absolutely. So we're gonna treat a Bible like a book. So if it's, again, if it's in good shape, then you put it on a bookshelf, you know, if it, you know, can stand up, you have it stand up. If it needs to lie flat, you can have it lie flat. You can get a box for it. You can get one of those, you can make a you know, a phase box yourself, which is basically just boards that, you know, they're acid-free boards, and you cut them into a box and you can tie it together with linen tape. It's called tape, but it's not, it's like a ribbon. It's called linen tape, and you tie it together and then it keeps it. You can have a custom box made for it if it's something that's really special and you want to do that, you can do that also. Yeah, but I mean, if it's in good shape, then you could do that. I mean, if it's falling apart and it needs repairs, then you could probably speak to a conservator and they would be able to rebind it for you. Yes.
Which website on this list, did you say would be a conservator to rebound, like?
Oh, yeah, the, God, I forget what, they changed their name, but it's the one that has 2 on there. I put all my copies in the back because I just changed it yesterday. It's basically a professional organization for conservators, so you'd be able to find one. There's also at the Library, on the Library of Congress's website, they also have a link for finding a conservator on there as well. I'm not sure where that takes you, but it's the, it's like the American something.
Institute for Conservation.
Yeah, yeah. Mhm.
Everyone, thank you so much. If there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and thank you, Gabby.
Mhm. Thank you. Did you have a question?
I was just curious about the boxes. Are those for sale here?
Oh, yeah, you can.
Yes,
upstairs.
so you're welcome. This is for our virtual audience too. You can email balchlib@leesburgva.gov or leave your information with me. need like maybe a week or so to pull the materials to get together for the boxes. But the archival starting kit is $40 and then the photograph starting kit is $45.